Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Ulrich. I'm director of NYU Washington, D.C., and on behalf of the John Brademas Center for the Study of Congress and New York University, I'd like to welcome you to the Constance Milstein and Family Global Academic Center. Before our introductions of the panel, I'd like to recognize two of our D.C. colleagues for organizing tonight's event, Tom McIntyre, who's our Assistant Director for External Relations and Special Programs, and Shruti Ramadugu, our Program Coordinator, wherever they are. And before I start tonight, I thought I'd just go for 1 minute off script to remember our friends in Boston and to recognize that while we're having a momentous and celebratory night here, that it's a very difficult struggle there. So I know that they're all on our thoughts tonight. Tonight, our featured guests will discuss an institution of which many of you will know well, the U.S. Senate. Senator Tom Daschle has participated in the development and debate of almost every major public policy issue of the last 3 decades. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1978 from the great state of South Dakota, where he served for 8 years. In 1986, Senator Daschle was elected to the U.S. Senate and became the Democratic leader in 1994. He is one of the longest-serving Democratic leaders in history and the only one to serve twice as both majority and minority leader. Since leaving the Senate, Senator Daschle has remained an active and learned voice among policymakers. He has emerged as a thought leader on climate change and renewable energy policy. As an advisor through the 2009 passage of the health care reform legislation, he has also distinguished himself as a leader in health care. In 2007, Senator Daschle joined with former majority leaders George Mitchell, Bob Dole, and Howard Baker to create the Bipartisan Policy Center, an organization dedicated to finding common ground on some of the most pressing public policy challenges of our time. Senator Daschle serves on the board of the Center for American Progress, which has NYU internship students, and the National Democratic Institute, and is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Welcome, Senator Daschle.
Thank you very much.
Senator Byron Dorgan from the great state of North Dakota served as the U.S. Senate leadership for 14 years, first as Assistant Democratic Floor Leader and then as Chairman of the Democratic Policy Committee. He has had a prolific career in public service at both the state and federal levels. Senator Dorgan has served his state for the U.S. Congress for 30 years after first being elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1981. Over the course of his career in public office, Senator Dorgan has consistently promoted and defended the economic needs of rural America, advocated for renewable energy and energy independence, and for sound economic policies. He is recognized as a leader in energy, aviation, agriculture, water, economics, and Indian issues. Welcome, Senator Dorgan. Liz Sidoti, our moderator for evening, is the political editor in Washington for the Associated Press. She has covered national politics for the AP since 2003. She was named National Political Writer in 2009, becoming the AP's lead reporter covering national campaigns while tracking political trends in federal, state, and local governments and in the country at large. She is a veteran of 2 presidential campaigns in 2004 and 2008, and 2 midterm congressional campaigns in 2006 and 2010. She was a White House reporter for the AP covering President Barack Obama's first 6 months in office, and also spent 18 months reporting from Congress on national security and foreign affairs issues. She joined the AP in Cincinnati in 1999 and spent 4 years covering the Ohio State House and politics. Prior to AP, she did reporting stints at the Columbus Dispatch, the Repository in Canton, Ohio, and the Recorder Courier in Portage County, Ohio. Liz, thank you for moderating this evening.
Thank you. Well, first of all, we want to say thank you to NYU for having us here. And I have to acknowledge that as I was back and talking with Senator Dorgan about all the places I had traveled to, I realized that the only 2 states in the nation that I haven't traveled to are South and North Dakota. So my apologies in advance. Senator Daschle, I want to start with you. Basically, we'll do about 30 minutes of questions from here, and then I want to open it up to everybody else because I'm sure that there are former staffers who are looking forward to grilling you guys when you're on the hot seat. But Senator Daschle, when I heard that you were writing a book and actually half of the book, roughly, I was very surprised at the type of book that it was. And I have to say that I will recommend that every political writer and policy writer in Washington read it, because I would argue that reporters need to get up to speed a little bit more on the state of the Senate. And so I just kind of wondered, why write this type of a book? Because it is more textbook than what you normally see from former senators when they come out of Congress.
Well, Liz, first of all, let me thank you and Byron for your willingness to be a part of the program, and Tom and Judy and NYU for organizing it, and all of you for coming. I really appreciate it a lot. Byron and I have a lot of things in common. One thing that we share is a publisher, St. Martin's Press, and they're just Thomas Dunn Books. Tom Dunn is just a great guy, and he came to me a couple of years ago and he said, we want to create a series of books about government that allow the reader to have more of a relevant appreciation of what the institutions look like and work like today. Not just how a bill becomes a law, not just how you might describe in sort of stark detail what happens in the United States Senate officially, but sort of give a little bit more of the color around what the institutions look like today in today's context. And to use the book as an opportunity for college students in particular to be more appreciative of what the Senate, the House, and the presidency look like. So Dave Obey is writing a book on the House, and there'll be a book on the presidency as well. And as a result, it's part of a series that we hope will be of value to college students and to others who might have less of an appreciation of the Senate than they'd like.
Well, even those of us, like I said, who've covered it can get a lot out of it. So I want to turn now to talk a little bit about Boston. And both of you obviously were in the Senate during 9/11. And while we don't know precisely what happened in Boston at this time, it is being treated as an act of terror. And over the course since 9/11, this would be the first time that we are actually hit with a bomb on U.S. soil. Of course, we have gone through other tragedies, Newtown and Fort Hood, even Superstorm Sandy. But since the 9/11 attacks, is this different though? Is there a different feeling? And I guess what I mean by that is, does some of the 9/11 anxiety come back with when we heard yesterday what had happened?
Well, I might say a couple of things, but I'd certainly be interested in what Byron has to say. I obviously our hearts and thoughts and prayers go to all of the families affected and to the people of Boston generally. Anytime this happens, I think there's a unifying effect. There's the outward sympathy and an extraordinary sense of grief is something we all share as Americans and as people concerned about these circumstances and the implications for them. I think it could be a very transformational moment. Maybe not as transformational as 9/11 was, but certainly I think we're going to be looking at sporting events and endurance events in a different way. There's no way one can ignore. If I were the planner of the next marathon somewhere, I'd be very concerned about how I would assure security and safety. You've got first this notion of somehow creating a safety zone in 26 miles, which is almost impossible to do to anyone's satisfaction. And so obviously you have all of those practical concerns. But again, it raises, even though we've never really gotten comfortable with the notion that 9/11 is history, I think we've learned to live with it a little bit more. And now that memory, that nightmarish experience has been restored. And I think there's a fear and a paranoia and a concern about safety that this has triggered that I don't think will go away for a while.
Senator?
Yeah, well, I agree with all that Tom has said. Let me come back just for a moment to the introduction here, and then let me respond on the Boston issue. First of all, thanks to NYU and thanks to Tom for writing a really remarkable book. I read it, and Tom would, using his North Dakota joke, I'm sure, believe that someone read it to me. But I honestly read it, and it's a book that describes how the Senate works, but with a lot of texture and stories and interesting anecdotes, which I think is really important. And so to Tom Dunn and St. Martin's and to Tom Daschle and so on, congratulations to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know whether this is transformational or not. I think back to a guy driving a truck up to the courthouse in the federal building in Oklahoma City. Mm-hmm. What an unbelievable horror he visited upon so many Americans that day. And of course, that lives in our memory. There are other incidents that live in our memory, more recently, Newtown. And this is truly a tragedy in Boston, and it reminds us the fragile nature of our country. We are a free and open country. There's no guarantee ever that in a free and open country you can prevent every incident from happening. It reminds us also, it seems to me, of the importance of emergency personnel, people working together, volunteers, and then the governing structure, the law enforcement folks. It reminds us how important that aspect of life is in our country. And I think all of us go to bed at night grieving that this has happened, and with admiration for the people of Boston and the way they have been dealing with it. And we hope very much that we find the person who perpetrated this act and bring that person or persons to justice.
Well, as expected, when something like this happens, the first thing that happens is, the president and the Republican leaders in Congress all say the same thing, which is now, we are not Republicans, we're not Democrats, we're Americans, and that's the first thing. And so there's this veneer of bipartisanship that we hear, and yet this, as we all know, is fleeting, and particularly in this time. And so I want to talk a little bit about the dysfunctional nature and our polarized politics. And Senator Daschle, you write in the introduction of your book that institutions in many respects are no better than the people who run them. The Senate reflects the country. We get what we vote for. So in November, the American public voted again for divided government. What was the message they were trying to send there? Was it a message of, work together in bipartisanship, or was it a message of gridlock? And has it always been this bad? Is this the worst polarized partisanship that you've seen?
I think it is. Actually, I think it's improved in the last couple of months, and I'm hopeful that that's a trend. But I oftentimes like to ask audiences if they can imagine 310 million people in one stadium with the president down in the middle of that stadium asking all 310 million Americans what our tax policy should be, or what our health policy should be. If you can only imagine the cacophony of voices and the extraordinary opinions expressed both emotionally and factually and substantively and in as many other characterizations as you can make it, that's really what happens on the floor of the Senate and the House. And I think the message in the last election was, as you might expect, with that visual picture in mind, a mixed one. It was mixed in part because of the results, but I think it's mixed in part as a result of people's attitudes. There are a lot of people who send their member of Congress to Washington saying, stand your ground. Stand up for what you believe and never back down. Mm-hmm. We want you to stand for the things we believe in, and be it ultra-conservative, or in some cases maybe ultra-liberal. But I think that notion of standing your ground is very strongly felt among some of the voters. There's a larger group, maybe not as vocal, but I think it is larger, who believe that you ought to find common ground. Mm-hmm. And that at some point, even though you stand your ground initially, you come to the middle and you come to some realization of the need for governance, in addition to the need to articulate a particular point of view. Unfortunately, you have that tug of war between those two admonitions to members of Congress almost daily. And some, of course, listen to the majority in their audience, especially if it's a primary majority they're concerned about. And now we have roughly, out of 435 members of Congress, I'm told that as few as 35 are really competitive today in a general election.
Right.
Many more are competitive in a primary. So people who are concerned about their base listen to those who are demanding that they stand their ground, and we're now seeing the result of that in the last few years.
So sure, gerrymandering has
No
impacted
question.
this in a significant way. Is it as bad now as it's ever been? And I agree with you. We are seeing the embers and the seeds of some bipartisanship, but is gun legislation really going to go anywhere? Doesn't look like it if you read what's going on today. Immigration perhaps. So is it as bad as we think it is?
I'm not old enough to know whether this is the worst. Democracy's been around a long, long while, but this has deteriorated more substantially than anything I've experienced in my 30 years in Congress. I think it would be the same for Tom. It's not as if these flames of passion on both sides haven't always existed there, but it is that there are now very aggressive people on both sides with fans that are fanning the flames of passion. And they do it with microphones, they do it through talk radio and cable television and so on. And now, so the American people are very divided, and it's not surprising that they elect a Congress that's very divided. And they actually insist in elections for people who are standing for election to promise them that when they get to Washington, when confronted with the challenge of, do I stand for my principles or do I compromise, they force them to promise, when I go there, I will promise you this. Mm-hmm. And make sure I meet this promise. I will never, ever, ever compromise. Well, that is, the lubrication of democracy is the ability of people who feel differently to find some common ground. It is compromise. So it is not a good situation for our country. It's not surprising to me. The American people are very divided on a number of things. But on some things, for example, if I might, we're going to come to guns probably, and a vote on the issue of one aspect of that, and that is the gun show loophole and the ability to get a background check on the transfer of guns. Well, the American people, all the polls suggest 80 or 90% believe that is the reasonable, right, and common sense thing to do. That won't translate to 90% or 80% in the Congress. There's still a question of whether they will even get that. So the Congress is perhaps even more dysfunctional and more divided than the people who came out to vote for them.
But what's bad? Please.
I was just going to say, you asked the question, Liz, is this the worst it's ever been? And I like Byron, can't remember back beyond 30 years. But many years ago, I was given the journal of Isaac Bassett, and some of my staff who know this story but know that Isaac Bassett was Daniel Webster's page, the second page to serve in the Senate, and he wrote a journal that is now by volume about 3,000 pages. And he worked for 64 years in the Senate. And he gives us firsthand account of extraordinary things that happened during his 64 years. But he writes vividly about many of the physical confrontations that actually occurred on the Senate and House floor with canes and guns and knives and all.
Those were the days.
And so I can safely say there have not been any guns, knives, or canes on the Senate floor, at least in recent times. So by that standard, things have improved.
And I know you need to ask another question before you prompt 5 or 6 answers here.
I was warned you guys may filibuster, so go right ahead.
let me just tell a story, if I might, because there is a more genteel way to disagree with one another, and there's a less acerbic way to criticize one another. These days, liar, traitor.
Right.
We know the words and how raw and angry the politics will be. Well, one day I was presiding over the Senate, and tell a story about Robert Byrd. When Robert Byrd was healthy and aggressive in the Senate, which was most of his life.
He was aggressive
he
still
was
when
amazing.
he was not, when he wasn't.
So there was another senator on the floor who was disrespectful to the presidency of the United States, and Robert Byrd found great fault with that. And that senator was doing it all the time, every day. And finally, Robert Byrd came to the floor, and as that senator ceased talking, Robert Byrd stood up and sought recognition, and he said this: "Mr. President, I have served in the Senate long enough to watch pygmies strut like colossus. They, like the fly in Aesop's fable, sitting on the axle of a chariot, observe, 'My, what dust I do raise,' and then sat down." I don't think Senator Santorum quite ever understood how abrasive that criticism was, but contained in a very different set of language.
Well, how much of this, though, goes to the notion of social networking and the technology and how quick we all are in this country to criticize because there's no ramifications for that. I mean, talk radio, cable talk shows, all that, the changes in the technology. I mean, this is where society is headed, right? It's just reflected in the Senate in a different way in Congress. Would you agree with that?
Well, media has had a huge impact on what has happened. I don't think there's any question. It used to be, I remember talking to Senator Hollings one day, who hated cameras. He just didn't think those cameras had a place. And he used to say, when I started in this business, people came to the floor to talk to each other. He says, now they talk to those stupid cameras. And he said it's changed the tone and the chemistry in this place completely. Mm-hmm. And I think he's right. I think there was a great deal of frustration brought about in large measure because people no longer talk to each other. They're giving speeches and they become increasingly hyperbolic, in part because you want to make news, and in part because you want to speak to your base, and in part because generally you can get more attention if you speak in such hyperbolic ways. And I think it has. I mean, there's a lot of good that has come from greater transparency with cameras and with media generally, but I think it's had some downsides, and certainly one of them is a lack of intimacy. I'll share one other, and Byron may remember this well too. During impeachment, we couldn't decide whether to have cameras or not have cameras, so the compromise was, and Liz, you may remember this, but we decided we'd cut the cameras off at 6 o'clock, and people could speak after that if they chose to do so. After 6 without any cameras. I can't tell you how meaningful those speeches and those conversations were after 6 o'clock. People were more candid. They spoke to us rather than spoke to the cameras. And it was just an entirely different experience. And so it was probably the best illustration I've seen of what cameras can do.
As a reporter, I mean, you see that all the time, right? We catch you guys in the hallways with our pads and our pens, and just generally people are more open, but put a camera in front and it's hard, and it's the gotcha component that everybody I think is kind of watching out for. So in an era where we focus on, the public says they want authenticity, it's then changed, right? Folks aren't as authentic. There's so much ground we could cover, but I want to jump over to immigration for a minute because Senator Dorgan, I'm going to pick on you a little bit. If my research is correct, you voted in 2007 to oppose the Kennedy-McCain comprehensive immigration legislation, correct?
I voted I offered the amendment that...
Maybe there was a backstory.
Right. I offered the amendment that won by one vote, which included the vote of the now President of the United States, but it would have sunsetted the guest worker program after 5 years. And the reason for that is they were proposing to bring in millions of guest workers. Mm-hmm. And my feeling is, after 5 years, sunset it, make a judgment. Does it work? Did it work? How does it work? And then decide whether you want to continue it. It won by one vote and was considered a poison pill by those on the other side, which is always the case. People who write a bill in committee and bring it to the floor of the House or the Senate, they say, you can't amend this. If you're going to offer an amendment, it's a poison pill. It's like pulling a loose thread on a cheap suit and an arm falls off, right? Every amendment's going to be a poison pill. Well, that was the case, and I know they're now saying that was what upended the bill. Well, look, we need to do immigration reform. We need to do it the right way. My feeling is that there's a lot of really serious work underway. They've now announced an approach that I think probably has great merit from just the sketchy things I've seen. This is bipartisan. It's one of the things that is happening that gives, I think, Tom and I some hope. Real behind-the-scenes bipartisan work that results now in a piece of legislation that may well pass the Congress.
Would you vote for what the Gang of Eight has come up with?
Well, I don't think, probably so. I don't know that we know all of the details of it, but it appears to me to be a pretty solid approach.
What has changed, Senator, in terms of the Republicans came around, they looked at their numbers, they saw that they were losing mightily with Hispanics. But is that the only thing that's changed in this country to make it more tenable that we do comprehensive immigration reform?
I think there are a lot of constituencies who really want to see it happen beyond just primarily the ethnic communities, the Hispanic community in particular. Business would like to see it. Agriculture would like to see it. So there are, labor would like to see it done right. And so I think these constituencies have also been catalytic in bringing about a better environment. But I think it also takes, what I was trying to say with that passage you read in the book, it takes at least a couple of leaders, somebody who's willing to take this. Ted Kennedy was so good at providing leadership on immigration. He worked with Alan Simpson way back 20 years ago as we took up the bill. You have to find the right combination of leadership as well. And I think the Gang of Eight, it may be not entirely equally distributed in terms of leadership capacity and leadership interest, but I think it took that group, and it took Marco Rubio and Chuck Schumer and John McCain in particular to I think, move this along. And that's what's missing oftentimes, is this commitment on the part of a few senators to really put in the effort and the elbow grease it takes to push this along. Dick Durbin deserves credit, too. I guess he was the first one who went to Marco Rubio and approached him with the hope that he would be involved. But oftentimes you just don't see that. Guns. I mean, you've got Pat Toomey and and a couple of other people who have really been willing to put their names on the line and move the legislation. And I think Joe Manchin deserves special credit for the work he did. And even though the background check may not be everything about the bill, it's one major component. And that's what it takes. Sometimes the leaders themselves can do it, but more often than not, it's people who have the wherewithal and the passion to take that small group of people and move the process along.
But with guns, it's a little different, seems to me, than with immigration, because with guns, what you have is back in 1994, when you were both in Congress, the assault weapons ban passed, and that was a very tough fight. What we see now is that the assault weapons ban isn't even on the table right now. We're talking about, there are a lot of issues that aren't on the table as it relates to gun control, and what we're talking about now is expanded background checks. So Senator Dorgan, what has happened? Was it the NRA got stronger, or what's happened with the mindset of the country and the mindset of lawmakers? Does this go back to gerrymandering like we talked about?
I think the political system has moved to the right some. By right, I mean the right side of, let me rephrase that. It's become more partisan on the right, the political right. And I think it's very difficult to get those kinds of things through the Congress. I mean, I think most people would say, you know what, I don't think we should be selling across the counter of a gun store a weapon that is a military-designed weapon. I mean, a military-style assault weapon, I think most people would agree that's not for civilian use. It's designed for the military. And in the early 90s, Dianne Feinstein offered that amendment. It passed, became law, and I think it was probably sunsetted and never been able to recapture it. And again, it's because the politics has moved.
Yeah, but what's fascinating to me is the politics have moved in different ways on different issues. Look at gay marriage. Okay, that certainly hasn't moved to the right. It's actually moved to the left in terms of the public opinion. What do you make of these huge swings in public opinion that we've seen in even just the last 6 months on gay marriage, on immigration, on pot legalization?
Well, I think it's interesting that I think the younger people in particular are having more of a voice, and organizationally are impacting the public debates more. I think on most of the issues involving gay marriage and all of the issues in the military, gays in the military, I think it's really largely generational. And as younger voters become much more vocal and much more organized, it seems to me that it's having a profound effect. But society too changes, and I think media, in part, is a big reason why. I mean, the ability for the social networks to be able to advocate and to interact and to communicate in a way that we couldn't before has given a lot of these groups a lot more power and authority, both on the right and on the left.
Can I just mention, I think when politics becomes too extreme, the American people react to that as well in a not a very positive way. And I think what happened in the last presidential election is you had, 10 or so candidates on the Republican side in primary after primary after primary debate, went on and on and on. And in each of those debates, it was who could get the farthest to the right to thread that needle. And I think as a result of that, some of them are now trying to get well politically because, I think the American people reacted very negatively to that. Immigration is a good example. So, I think when politics becomes too extreme, the American people then begin to say, you know what, you got to bring it back. This is really a country that has a strong center to it, a strong political center. And it strays from time to time, but it always comes back to that strong political center.
And are we seeing that be then reflected in some of the bipartisan overtures we've seen on the Hill?
I think
so. Yeah, but I have to give Senator Reid credit. He's doing. They just had I think it was the first joint caucus that they've had in years. I was with Olympia Snow a couple weeks ago in San Diego, and we were on a panel, and she was asked when the last joint caucus was, and she couldn't remember. But they had one about a week ago, and they showed a film of John McCain, who talked in a very, just an extraordinarily personal way about his experiences as a prisoner of war, what it was like, and how he communicated. And according to senators who were in the room, there wasn't a dry eye in the place at the end of the caucus, and it led everybody to say, why don't we do this more often? And so I'm inclined to believe that maybe we're beginning to see some efforts to try to bring people together in a more effective way.
Well, I could talk for hours, and I know the two of you could as well, but I want to give us a chance to open it up for questions. Yes, sir.
Hold on one second.
One of the problems with Congress, it seems to me, and I think it's reflected in the low approval ratings, is that Congress doesn't seem to be at all proactive in anything it does. It is primarily reactive. For instance, gun legislation would never have come to the table except for Newtown. Obviously, we're waiting now with North Korea. North Korea was on the back burner only when they raised the issue and threatened missile tests. Iran is another thing. Why is it always brinkmanship? The debt ceiling, we wait till the last minute. Why can't there be any system where the Congress can anticipate things and avoid all these crisis management situations?
That's a great question, and I don't know if you remember the name Leon Firth. He worked with Al Gore for many, many years, I think close to 25 years. And Leon, with that very question in mind, has spent the last 2 years asking why and how we might do a better job of proactively addressing many of these issues, and has put out an extensive report that I think may be online. He's worked with the White House and worked with members of Congress to see if we might incorporate some of the ideas that he has recommended. But I think what has happened oftentimes in Congress is that it's a little bit like the fire department. The fire department responds to 5 alarm fires and 3 alarm fires. they don't nearly get to fire prevention as frequently as they'd like. And so Congress is a little bit like the fire department. We're responding to fires because partly that's where the media is. I mean, that's where the people are demanding that you respond to these things. But partly as well, I think it's so hard to reach consensus proactively. It may even be impossible in some cases because they don't have the pressure to reach that consensus. And so you oftentimes kick around ideas, but never really get to a critical tipping point to bring about the change required. But I think it's largely the mindset, dealing with the biggest issues because they're the ones that fall on your plate and demand the most attention.
And I think that there are some big things that have happened, but I take your point that not much is happening now that appears to be constructive. The biggest failing, in my judgment, for a long, long time is the lack of oversight by the congressional committees. There's just not enough oversight, hearings on oversight, to find out what works and what doesn't. But let me just mention a few things. These don't happen often, but in 1986, I was on the Ways and Means Committee. We wrote the major tax reform bill back in 1986, a big tax reform piece of legislation. Americans for Disabilities Act. Think of how that has changed our country and changed life for so many people. The recent health care reform bill that was passed, Tom has written a lot about that. I mean, that was a big, big deal. It's very hard to pass major legislation on new things. Tom mentioned Ted Kennedy, and I think one of the things that I remember about Ted Kennedy is he was not an impatient man in terms of the way he legislated. He was always impatient about wanting things to happen, but he understood sometimes it would take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but he always had his foot in the door trying to make sure that he was advancing those issues. And then ultimately you'd get a big piece of legislation passed. So I'm as frustrated as you are, and I know Tom is, that not many big things are happening at the moment. But it's not, it's not impossible that things will once again turn around and we'll see the Congress be tackling big, abiding issues that the country expects it to tackle.
Yes.
With respect to gun control legislation, you mentioned that the other two aspects, the ban on assault weapons and the ban on large magazines, are basically off the table now. But I wonder if the background check bill passes, will it be interpreted as a defeat for the NRA, thereby weakening it and possibly opening the door to further gun control legislation?
That's a great question. I don't. It'll be interesting to see. I don't think that the bill, if it were to pass with the background check, would be viewed as a real significant achievement in terms of meaningful progress on gun legislation. But I think it would be seen symbolically as a political victory for, especially for families who have been lobbying so hard to see this legislation ultimately pass. I don't think the issue will go away. I was encouraged by many people who were quoted as saying, look, regardless of what happens on this, we're not going to give up. And I think eventually, as Byron said, the American people generally come to some realization that this has got to be done. And I think when you look at the polls, you already know they're there. They just haven't really articulated with any real public consensus or a commitment that they want to see the Congress act beyond what they've done so far. But I think it could be catalytic in bringing about additional efforts to do something more substantive as time goes on.
And when you say off the table, my hope and expectation would be that there will be votes on all of those issues in the Senate. With the bill being on the floor, I expect that some will probably require a cloture vote, but certainly we will have people casting a decision, a vote on large magazines, I expect, and also the issue of the assault weapon ban.
Yes, sir.
Hi. You touched on gerrymandered districts a bit and the threat that poses to compromising. But you also mentioned that only about 35 districts, I think, are competitive now. So I wonder if we've already reached this tipping point, what prospects do we have for really, improved institutional compromise looking forward? Thanks.
That's a great question.
Yeah, no, it isn't just the gerrymandering districts. You have a lot of bright-colored states, red in particular, where the primary is just as important. All one has to do is to look at Indiana, look at Utah with Bennett, look at Delaware with Mike Castle, to see that even statewide elections are affected by the primary, the primary syndrome, I'll call it, the extraordinary power. And the reason is fairly simple. Voter turnout on primaries is fairly low. It's not that hard if you're organized and well-funded to influence the outcome of these primary votes. So that's in part, I think, what's driving a lot of this today. But again, I think in a lot of these areas, the American people are becoming more and more concerned about what the implications are. And I'm not so sure that over time, with the implications of this trend becoming clearer, the dysfunctional nature of Congress, the lack of ability to address the meaningful issues, the tone and the polarization that has existed among members, I think all of that has kind of worn down the enthusiasm in some locations for this primary approach, and could ultimately have some effect on the way tone and ultimately the way Congress acts.
I think it's regretful that there are some really terrific men and women, Republicans and Democrats, who should run and would run but will not now run for public office. They take a look at the dysfunction. They say, that's not something I want to be a part of. Public service, again, I come back to the people with big microphones that make judgments every day about members of Congress, and they're not journalists. The real journalists are terrific people
You can
who
say it.
do great service to our country. But I think there are a lot of people that just decide they're not going to be a part of it, and that's too bad. The Senate should be, and I hope will be, the world's greatest deliberative body. At the moment, it is not, because it's gripped with gridlock.
But you can't have this conversation. I agree completely with what Byron said, but you can't have a conversation without mentioning the word money. Money is having such an extraordinarily destructive effect on Congress and the Senate in several ways. One, the money chase becomes more severe with every cycle. It's just amazing to me, cost of elections today. My race in 2004 was the most expensive to that date, $50 million total spent on that race. But that's nothing compared to the last cycle, where in Virginia and Massachusetts, the total amount spent was, in each case, over $80 million. And so, to Byron's point, you look at the costs involved with running in a competitive race today, and you look and you realize that a typical senator has to raise $10,000 for every day he or she is in office to be able to get to the nominal amount of money required to be reelected. And when you realize that in the last 2 years of any senator's cycle, if it's a competitive race, they spend anywhere from 1/2 to 2/3, maybe even as much as 3/4 of their time raising money, we've got to deal with that. It's too corrosive, it's too destructive, and it's having an extraordinary effect on the way the Senate functions today.
Can I hasten to say, though, that, I don't want us, and we're not contributing to some notion by some people that the Senate is populated with a bunch of slothful, indolent oafs who couldn't find their way to the restroom. The Senate is populated, even with its dysfunction, by remarkable men and women. They are extraordinary. If you had a chance to spend an evening with one of them just around a table, pick anyone. They got there because they have some significant skills and a passion for wanting this country to succeed. And yet somehow the system has come to a screeching halt. And we've got to hope and expect that this system of ours will correct itself, and this country's best days will still remain ahead of it.
That's well said.
Speaking of corrections, given both your histories in the Senate How would you like to see the filibuster and how it's used change going forward, or would you?
Well, the two things that I think really should be done, neither of them are easy, but I think they would have a big effect. When you look at filibuster history, from 1917 to 1967, there were 48 filibusters. We had 112 in the last Congress. And that's all you need to know about the proliferation of new filibusters. What has happened? Well, two things in particular. We started as a reform in the 1980s with this notion that it was probably a better use of one's time and more efficient use of the Senate's time to set a bill aside if it's subject to a filibuster. And that's what we call dual tracking. We would put that bill aside and on a dual second track take up another bill. Well, we're now quintuple tracking. We're setting that many bills aside because they're all subject to a filibuster. My sense is that we've got to go back to saying, look, you want a filibuster? We're just going to do it until we resolve it one way or another. We're not going to dual or triple or quadruple track. We're going to do this bill or this nomination, period. And oh, by the way, and here's number two, you got to hold the floor. We've made filibusters too easy. There's no pain any longer, either legislatively or personally. And leaders get so much grief if they require senators to hold the floor, especially if it's through the night. And again, they get it's amazing the pushback I got oftentimes from senators who said, I have a big fundraiser in Los Angeles I got to get to. You can't do this. And my whole race, my career is on the line if I can't get out to do these events. You just have to say, look, that's tough. We're going to do this. But as I say, and I'm not in any way criticizing Harry or anybody else for not doing that, because it is difficult and there are other extenuating circumstances. But to me, those are the two things that we used to do in that period from 17 to 67 that we're not doing today, and I think it's had a huge effect on the number of filibusters and the way we run the Senate.
I would have eliminated, if I had had my way, just to write the new rule, I would have eliminated the filibuster on the motion to proceed. You still have a filibuster on the bill. You still have a filibuster opportunity on every amendment to the bill. The motion to proceed is now routinely filibustered, which is an abuse in my judgment, and I think had they eliminated that, they would have been somewhere down the road that would have been constructive.
Oh, we're here.
I was wondering what your view was on open primaries. They're doing those in California and states like that. How do you think they're going to impact the process? We had in the House side the Sherman-Berman race, which ended up being kind of ugly, but it was Democrat versus Democrat. And you've seen that also in amongst Republicans, but basically we're just the top two candidates.
I like it. I think it reduces the importance of the primary as the sole determinant of the ultimate victor. And so I like it. I think it's probably too early to tell whether it has long-lasting impact. I think it's a good thing. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't experiment more with concepts like that to see if we can find some ways to minimize just what trends there are in politics and primaries today.
I do too, and I think there are some who have never had a contest, get elected, and that's it, till they retire or die or whatever happens to them. They never have a contest. And I think a contest of ideas, whether it's within your party or intra-party, is really healthy. And so we saw that, and some of it was uncomfortable in the last election. But you know what? In some ways, I think it's constructive. I agree with Tom.
This one up here.
As a recent graduate who is facing the incredibly high unemployment rates of this country, I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on the compromise that you're talking about between the Democrats and Republicans on the fiscal cliff and the debt ceiling, as to how, not so much how Republicans are going to compromise, but how would you suggest the Democrats compromise on this financial stress that the country's undergoing?
Well, I think that it's clear that the Republicans are primarily interested in entitlement reform. And I think that there's reason to be concerned about our entitlement programs as they currently exist with regard to the growing percentage of our budget that they include. 21% now for Medicare and Medicaid, bigger than defense. And so I think we've got to look at ways with which to deal with entitlement reform in a meaningful way. There are really two ways to do it. You can just cut and shift the costs onto somebody else, which we've been prone to do too often in the past, or you can redesign and improve these programs, which I hope that the Congress will take seriously. As I think there are some opportunities to redesign and improve, and that's partly what healthcare is all about. But we can go a lot farther. I think that would bring them, oftentimes, let me rephrase that, would create a conducive climate for negotiation on some of these things that have to be done. But I would hope that the Republicans would then reciprocate. I haven't seen very much willingness, it seems to me, on the part of most Republicans at least, to come to the table with serious proposals that would address revenue, address some of the other challenges that we're facing with regard to coming to terms with a larger deal. But nonetheless, I think both sides have a responsibility to try to do so.
We'll take one more. Yes. Oh, wait. Sorry.
There's a good chapter in the book on nominations, and you've talked about dysfunction and the filibuster. Maybe you could talk about judges and nominations process and how to unravel that, and how you feel about some of those who criticize you and the pace that they're currently on in terms of Obama's judge nominations.
Well, Jonathan, that's a good question and a fair point. I mean, there are times when some of these lifetime appointments generate a great deal of controversy. The Bork nomination was certainly one of them back in the 80s that generated lasting controversy. Unfortunately, I think that rare occasion when filibusters have been used in the past have multiplied many, many times. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but the number of, first of all, the length of time that judicial nominees have to endure to be confirmed is historic now. I don't know that we've ever reached this level of time required, and I'm very concerned about the implications for that. I've even at least considered the idea of accelerating the process for the consideration of confirmation of judges, and ultimately maybe even adjusting the filibuster itself to address these long and torturous periods of endurance for these nominees. I think to Byron's earlier point, I think we scare off a lot of people who might be willing to give up a good salary and be willing to give up the privacy that they've enjoyed as a private citizen for the opportunity to serve as a judge. But add to that the extraordinarily difficult and painful process of a nomination, and it's too much for some.
Let me come back to the previous question. I think Tom did a really good job of answering where on this spectrum there might be some room to negotiate compromise on the big economic issues. But I want to make another point as well, that however we do it, we have to find some equilibrium there. What we're doing is in every way destroying confidence that the American people have about the future. You know, first we have a cliff, then we have sequester, we have all these things. The fact is, people expand this economy when they feel secure and confident about their future. And if they don't, they contract this economy. So how are we going to get the kind of economic growth we need, robust growth, to find the new jobs for the kids coming out of college, if the American people aren't confident about the future? And how can they look at these cliffs and, every one of these periods that exist where it's, you're going to be in session till midnight and then pass something that lasts another 30 days, kick the can down the road. You can't be confident that way. So let me make one final statement, if I might. Whoever thought that someone from Aberdeen, South Dakota would carve his name in a Senate desk, or somebody from Regent, North Dakota would be able to carve their name in a Senate desk drawer and be part of history. But the quilt work of this country is people from all parts of America come with different views and different experiences, and bring those views and experiences to bear on what they think America's future should be. And no matter what we've said about gridlock and so on, the greatest privilege of my life, and I expect Tom's, has been serving in the Congress and especially in the Senate. And I am absolutely convinced that we tie ourselves in knots in this country for a while, and then we figure out that you got to untie it and move forward. This country always moves forward, and I think there are better days ahead. And I come to these discussions still with a pretty substantial understanding about the difficulties and why people are upset, but also a belief that things are going to be better.
There's a beautiful story, and I might just Byron inspired me to tell it, I think. But I love the stories of Benjamin Franklin. He was such an eloquent and sometimes witty and profound statesman, and had a huge effect, as everyone knows, on our country's creation. But there's a beautiful story that a couple of his biographers have shared. On the very last day of the Constitutional Convention, after everybody had been sitting for months, the last person called upon to speak was Benjamin Franklin, and because he was the most senior member, and he was supposed to kind of close out the discussions. And so as he rose, he said, "I have sat in this chair for the last several months, staring at the symbol in front of me on the back of the chair right here. And there's a sun that's halfway above the horizon." He said, "All of these months and all of these days, I've looked at that sun, trying to determine whether it's a setting sun or a rising sun." He said, "After the deliberations in these last several months, I've concluded this is truly a rising sun." Well, I think most of us still hold that view, that the sun continues to rise and that the bright days are still ahead, for the very same reasons that Benjamin Franklin thought that 220 years ago. Thank you all very much for coming.